I do want to say it's an honor to be here at the International Forum on Consciousness, and I'm very excited to share with you this inquiry into sound and its ability to shift our states of consciousness. Let's see, what would I add to what Penny said? I think one of the most formative reasons why I'm up here doing this is that I am deaf. I'm half deaf in both ears, and I wear hearing aids and lip read and all of that. And I think that sent me into a very deep dive of understanding and expressing and experiencing vibration, and shortly thereafter, consciousness. You can't really talk about vibration without talking about consciousness. You can't really study sound without a physicist and a neuroscientist and musicians. It's a very transdisciplinary effort to understand this. I noted that Avi made the same point. You need many minds. I wanted to give you an overview of the field, which will include looking at my dissertation. I wanted to also give you a quick preview of my pilot study in which I took the knowledge from the field and moved it forward. This is going to be experiential. We will move back and forward between the heart and the mind, between the science and the experience. And I will play some binaural beats music for you in the presentation, but if you want to actually experience the effects, please come to any one of the silent discos. You'll need to wear headphones to experience binaural beats. And in terms of how long you want to stay, at least 10 minutes. What we understand is that you need at least 10 minutes for your brain rhythms to change. So I wanted to begin with some live sound. I know you're all aware that we listened to some masters this morning, an amazing concert. But all of us can use sound. All of us can use sound. The point of all of these things is to bring us into our heart. And so you can use sound to ground yourself, to express your emotions. You know, maybe you don't need an antidepressant. Maybe you just need to create for a few minutes and share what's in your heart. So here we have two sets of bowls. Pure tones, these crystal bowls are pure tones. You can only get them here or in a laboratory. They're made out of silica, which is what Silicon Valley used to build computer chips with. So they transmit information, they transmit data. It was good enough for Silicon Valley. These are presumably Tibetan bowls. They belong to the Institute. And I did want to have them both here side by side. Tibetan bowls are crafted with great intention and prayer, and they have a very different sound, and people feel very differently when they listen to this style of bowls. So that's enough said. Let's just take a few minutes and drop into our heart together with these sounds and drop into a state of unity consciousness, which is what music allows us to do. take your time, take a couple deep breaths. These are powerful vibrations that will have moved you somewhere all together. And with the voice, with the human voice, which is still considered one of the most powerful healing tools that we have in shamanic practices, I sent intentions and blessings of peace and abundance and wisdom and joy. So may you receive all of those things, you and your families and our communities. Okay. And now for some science. I'll start with an overview of the dissertation. I do want to show you a lot on the way about what we know about the auditory pathways and how to use them, both regular sound and binaural beats, and the pilot study and the evidence-based formulas that I use and that I think you should look for if you are wanting to experience binaural beats. I should say I use binaural beats in my practice. I use them on my clients. I use them myself. I make them and I sell them. So that is my statement of conflict of interest. This was a really interesting article. It was a survey recently from the Global Drug Survey, 30,000 people in 22 countries, including the US, and 72% of the recipients do use binaural beats to help relax or fall asleep. But what was interesting was that 12% are saying they're using binaural beats to create the same high they get from taking a psychedelic drug. So what that tells me is that the new generations are expanding their concept of what it is to get high. Doesn't need to be a pill. It could be an experience. And I think that's part of the key here, part of the portal. I've been talking a lot with my colleagues about, well, where is the consciousness studies field going? Well, I think it's going into the study of psychedelics. And psychedelics and sound is a very interesting portal to travel together. So the dissertation, the point of the dissertation, which is to provide an overview and to summarize the progress of binaural beats in the three main fields. So here's the thing, it's not sound people studying binaural beats. It's neuroscientists using them for their original intention, which is to study the processes in the brain. It's health practitioners saying, can we use these binaural beats to reduce the amount of pain medication that our patients need before dentistry or some other surgical procedure? And then it's the field of cognitive psychology, obviously looking to see how we can change our brain states as needed. So we're going to summarize that. I'll quickly show you the 26 studies I reviewed and the recommendations I made as a result. So the umbrella here is sound healing and consciousness. The basic sound healing terms that we're going to use in this presentation all come from the field of physics. Vibration is an oscillation, right? It's a movement back and forth across a midpoint. That's it. Frequency is how fast that vibration moves. And we measure that in hertz. How many cycles per second did that frequency move? Energy, we don't know what it is yet. You can ask our astrophysicist here. We don't know. So we call it the power to do work, right? And here it's going to be represented by vibrations. Rhythms are just patterns of these oscillations in time. You could hear all the different oscillations from the bowls. Those are all different resonances. We'll talk about that. And then for the purpose of this presentation and this moment in time, consciousness is awareness, the creation of a relationship. I'm aware of you, and now we have a relationship, and our consciousness expands about what we can do with that relationship. Now, the two main things that sound healing talks about really are the power of entrainment and resonance. And so it's using the educated and conscious use of energy, of sound, to reach identified goals that promote wellness in the human system, including the expansion of consciousness. So what is really fascinating about entrainment and resonance is that essentially, I mean, we have a limited amount of energy, right? We run on energy, we run on electricity, and your body wants to use it efficiently. Entrainment and resonance describe ways that we use energy in our body. The first one, entrainment, is when one rhythm takes over another rhythm, causing it to synchronize. So see, the more powerful rhythm took over the less powerful rhythm, and now they're together. So that's what happens when rhythm synchronizes you. That's what happens when sunlight hits your retina and goes into your super chiasmatic nuclei, and then you are entrained to the sun, and that is your circadian rhythm, right? It comes from the sun. It's an entrainment, and sound also does that. Rhythm also does that. The other way of impacting a system is resonance. So that's an increase of amplitude when an input matches the natural frequency of a system. So those two frequencies have the same amplitude and cause the system to double. So if you continue to do that, you would cause a system to explode. An example of that is an opera singer singing into a crystal glass and hitting that resonance. That's what's happening there. So what are binaural beats? Everyone calls them entrainment because we've always thought of sound as entraining. But they're not really. Entrainment is real. I'm not saying sound entrainment is not real, but it comes from rhythm. It comes from something else. We have been using these repetitive rhythms since before written history. We have nice documented clinical evidence on what happens with drumming and entrainment. And we have a lot of research, specifically in the field of neurologic musical therapy, on how to use rhythmic entrainment with great clinical evidence and results. But binaural beats are not that. When you measure them, when you study their frequency following response, their electrical patterns, it's too weak to be entrainment. So one of the theories in the field is that it's a stochastic resonance, which is it's basically an enhancement, okay? Like a weak signal is boosted by adding white noise, which has equal energy at a range of frequencies. And both the description of binaural hearing as a process, which is enhanced by background noise, and the description all the study researchers give really aligns with this, but this is a hypothesis. And so one of my recommendations for research is right here. So let's ask, what is binaural hearing? Because binaural beats are hijacking that pathway. Binaural hearing is the ability to hear in two ears. Binaurally equipped species use it for locating auditory objects in space, such as predators, so we can flee from them or eat them. Or in modern civilization, humans use it to target the person's voice that we are trying to listen to at a restaurant, okay? So I want you to think about binaural hearing from the bird's eye view. What is it? It's a targeting mechanism. I need to target an auditory object in space, and my life may depend on it. See, that's not very different from entrainment, right? Entrainment means I want to dance with that object and match that object. So it makes sense to me what the science shows. And basically, our brain measures binaural hearing so here's a bird flying here, and it has a frequency. So my brain is measuring it between my two ears. There's a head shadow effect, and it's measuring time, it's measuring the frequency, the angle of frequency, and it's measuring the speed of the frequency. And the difference between those two signals is computed in my midbrain, and I identify the auditory object. Monaural sound is basically any sound that's right in front of us. Binaural is going to come from one side or another. So why is all of that important? We will get to that. But essentially, the first research that in contemporary time came from Dr. Gerald Oster, published in Scientific American in 1973. And really, the first people to use binaural beats was the Monroe Institute. Actually, we have one of the founders of the Monroe Institute here. Where is she? And yeah, it was very, very interesting to have her here. They have been working on this technology for decades. So what is a binaural beat then? It's a detuned frequency. So you take one frequency, say 440 hertz, and you detune it by the amount that you want to impact the brain with. Let's say that's 4 hertz. So then you have 440 in one ear and 444 in the other ear. So if you were to listen to that recording, I can play it for you here. So you hear the beating, the phasing. That's 8 hertz and 12 hertz together, beating and phasing. But you're not hearing the binaural beat. Binaural beats are, that difference frequency is an auditory illusion. So your brain is taking that difference frequency, and in the process of regulating itself, coming back to homeostasis, is doing something with that information. One other thing I want to say here is that binaural beats actually can be used to measure hormonal changes. How interesting is that? But it makes sense to me, right? Because the nervous system is what? It's a rhythm. Your nervous system is a rhythm. Your cardiovascular system is a rhythm. Your endocrine system is a rhythm. We are rhythmic. So sound, rhythms speak to us. Binaural beats happen to be able to allow us to measure the endocrine rhythm. So I wanted to just mention that these are the claims that you will see out there. And I think it's very important to study these claims and to get this technology out there. It's inexpensive. It's very easy to deliver. There's no stigma. One of my studies had soldiers in the field using it, or nurses. You can easily just take your personal player and put on your beats and calm yourself down. You may have just had a major trauma. And so it's an excellent delivery system. If you Google it on YouTube, I saw 40 million hits. This is not a secret. It's also not regulated. So we're going to keep addressing that today. So how do we start to get into the science of this? We're not able yet to measure the pathways of energy in a way that's comfortable for the mainstream. Back to Avi and his artificial intelligence, I think that will, so there is nothing as complicated as the human nervous system. Our nervous system, check this out, is the fulcrum between us and this invisible sea of vibrations around us, of data, that we must process every millisecond to understand, survive, make meaning. So we are extraordinary, right? And we're talking about the auditory component of this nervous system, but essentially nerves all behave the same. They do two things. They amplify or they inhibit. That's what your neurons do. They say, okay, here and ready, or okay, we're going to sleep so you can do your job. That's what a neuron does. And you'll see that's also what we measure when we're measuring states of consciousness. So to tie that point back together for you, since we can't measure energy, what can we measure? We can measure the human nervous system and how it's responding to the feedback that we're giving it. So can we predict these rhythms on the brain from the binaural beats? And can we predict their influence on the autonomic nervous system? So just to be clear, we're talking about the same brain frequencies that all the fields are talking about right now. Picture this like all roads lead to Rome. We, right now, are able to understand the brain waves, the patterns, and their correlative cognitive states in our brain and measure them. But how do we affect them? So we can affect them with yoga, with breathing, with movement, with plant medicine, with sound, with light, and everybody's studying how do we do this? That's the top of the mountain. That's where all the roads are trying to lead. And I'm going to keep talking about them like gears. If you've driven a manual car, this is first gear down here. That's fifth gear up there. And just to give you some context, so delta at 0.5, let's just say 1 hertz is in delta. This is our sleep mode. So that's 1 cycle per second, right? That's kind of like your heartbeat. Your heartbeat is 1 cycle per second. Violet light is something like 7 times 10 to the 14th hertz. Light is so fast. And our brain rhythms are just down here at the basic pulse of life. So how do we measure these rhythms? Oh, and by the way, all those rhythms are present all the time in your brain. You have all different cavities that resonate these rhythms. Your brain communicates to itself with rhythm, with these frequencies, right? So, and you have many frequencies going. We're addressing dominant states now, okay? So like rest in theta is a dominant theta state. Doesn't mean the other ones aren't there. And actually, the research is showing that it's more effective when you have multiple frequencies that you're introducing, right? But how do you get to those formulas? So we can measure brain waves with EEG, electroencephalography. That's just measuring the electricity on your scalp. Multi-layer perceptron networks are the AI application that you can put on these EEG readings. Functional connectivity measures, okay, how effectively are the different systems of the brain talking to each other? You can measure all those things. You can even measure a spectral analysis of the electromagnetic recording. You can measure the cardiovascular system, both with HRV and galvanic skin response. And you can use semi-quantitative, qualitative tools. To my mind, all the best studies use both, because you can corroborate what you're seeing on your numbers with the experience of the person. And you can do tests and tasks. Did these 10 math problems get faster after I used a focusing frequency? So now I want to talk to you about one of my favorite parts, which is the auditory brain, and show you how unbelievably remarkable you are right now. You don't have to do anything. You're magic. So we're going to talk about primary auditory pathway, a non-primary auditory pathway, and the hypothesis about how binaural beats work. So sound is a pressure wave in the air, and it comes in your ear. Okay, this is actually going to be fascinating, this scientific diagram, I promise you. It comes in, and then it starts knocking on that eardrum there, right? So now you have another mechanical wave. You have this mechanical wave, then you have that mechanical wave, and then it's knocking on water, and then you have water waves, right? So that's already 3 different kinds of vibrations. And that water triggers the cilia, which release chemicals, potassium and sodium. And those chemicals go into the auditory nerve of your brain, and you have now turned air pressure vibrations into electricity. This is an electricity delivering mechanism. Okay, so now we're at the blue dots, and we're in the form of electricity. So that's the beginning of the processing, and you can see there's a cross signal, right? They share signals across the hemispheres. And then we get to the green dot, the superior olivary nucleus. So that brainstem, that's where binaural hearing is processed. That's where your brain decodes all the timing cues and the phasing cues and the frequency cues, all of that. So you can relay right from there to a reflex, right? You go right to the motor brain from there. You hear a sound, you jump to get out of the way. So that's as far as we know for binaural hearing. We don't know what happens from there all the way to the auditory cortex on the red. When it gets to the auditory cortex, it's processed the same as regular sound. But from here to here, we don't know. You can't put electrodes in the human brain. So what we have is from electrodes in cat brains and things like that. But to continue with the hearing pathway, so the inferior colliculus, that's the midbrain, and that's the highest electricity. So when you measure frequency following response, you're measuring here. And then the yellow is going to be our point of focus. That's a fancy name for the thalamus. The thalamus is called the searchlight for consciousness in the brain. Let me just let that sink in. So it's in the thalamus that we process our response to our environment around us, whether we regulate down into sleep or whether we regulate up into an awake state. It's considered the gateway to consciousness, and actually right in the reticular activating system is where that happened. These are your three basic states of consciousness: asleep, resting, and awake. So the theory is, and it comes from Atwater, who was a researcher at the Monroe Institute, that the data from the binaural beats is processed here in the midbrain in this non-primary auditory pathway, and somehow as an enhancement, enhancing brain waves in your brain, enhancing theta brain waves, enhancing beta brain waves, enhancing delta brain waves. Now, as I told you, we don't have the science for that, but we can measure what we see binaural beats affecting. So what does the hypothalamus regulate? Okay, look at all these rhythms here. Circadian, because this is where the rhythms are for visual as well. And the hypothalamus also regulates the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so if the data does go in there and does travel these pathways, then when we measured the electrical response in human beings, we would see effect in this list. And I do want to point out to you here that these three RAS arousal states are essentially, looks like to me, correlating with the 5 basic brain states that we're studying, from slow to fast. So again, to my mind, that's another reason to research this area. So I learned all this information through a methodology called transdisciplinary review, which really allowed me to understand what makes a good binaural beat study. And as I looked into Swedenborg, who was the inspiration for this study, I thought, wow, he would have really liked this style of scholarship, because transdisciplinary review really marries the entire spectrum of knowledge, of knowing, from the intuitive to the scientific. It's an approach where you take your question and you go to whatever discipline that you need to get your answer. So you can have a whole panel of disciplines involved. And it allowed me to integrate these different fields, quantitative and qualitative research. This is a big deal, right? Because in the field of consciousness studies, the mainstream view is that it only exists if you can measure it. And that consciousness is created in our brain. This is the only place that it exists. And if we can measure it here, that's where it exists, and that's it. So this is a very big deal to open up this and say, are there other ways of measuring? Are there other ways of knowing? Can they inform each other? So I liked starting with a transdisciplinary review. It gave me a lot of material to make some intuitive guesses about what needed to be quantified all together. For example, like the mind-body energy field. I ended up with 26 studies. They were all clinically peer-reviewed studies. There have been many more since I did this. I just picked the 5 recent years when I did my review. And as you can see, they're in those 3 fields. And what I understood was that if you did do the right specifications, that you could get results reliably. So I compared 18 data points. Some of the important ones were that you have to choose correct brain frequencies for the cognitive state you want. You can't give someone theta for concentration. you needed the correct duration of BB. It has to be 10 minutes. And I've heard that from several fields. I think the nervous system just needs 10 minutes, whether it's binaural beats or whatever it is that you're trying to do. But many of the studies only did 2 minutes. You need the correct carrier frequency. We'll talk a little bit about that later. That's the frequency that's holding the difference tone. So what we know is that 440 hertz is a very effective frequency to use. That has to do with the shape of your skull. Inter-individual differences, gender, qualities like introversion or extroversion, those all make a difference. So I want to say to you, every single one of you in this room is different and hears differently, right?